David had always prided himself on being a man of reason, of structure. His life was built on predictability, the steady rhythm of his career, the quiet reliability of his home, and the unwavering love he believed he shared with his wife, Rebecca. But tonight, all of that was slipping through his fingers like sand. It started with something so small, so insignificant, that under any other circumstance he would have overlooked it. He had been searching for his keys in Rebecca's purse, an innocent, routine action when his fingers brushed against something unfamiliar, a small, crumpled piece of paper. At first, he barely glanced at it, intent on finding his keys. But as he pulled it out and turned it over, a wave of ice shot through his veins. A hotel receipt. The name of the establishment? The Westmore Inn. Was printed in bold at the top. The date leapt out at him, a vicious slap of betrayal. It was from last Friday, the night he had been out of town for a business conference. David's breath hitched, his pulse roaring in his ears. He read and reread the details as if the ink might change if he stared at it long enough. A single night stay, paid in full. The name on the receipt was Rebecca's. His hands trembled as he let the purse slip from his grasp, its contents spilling onto the floor. Lipstick, loose change, a compact mirror. All meaningless clutter compared to the damning proof in his hands. For a moment, David forced himself to consider the alternatives. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe Rebecca had met a friend in need, paid for a room, and left. Maybe, but as he stood there in the quiet stillness of their home, the home they had built together, the truth gnawed at him. A sickening sense of inevitability settled in his gut. He had always trusted Rebecca. He had never once suspected her of infidelity. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but what marriage was? They had their moments, arguments over mundane things, occasional cold silences. But he had never imagined this. When the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house, David barely had time to compose himself. Rebecca walked in, her expression warm and relaxed. She was carrying a bag of groceries, humming softly to herself. She didn't notice him right away, standing rigid in the dim kitchen. "Hey, you're home early," she said, setting the bags down. She turned to face him then, smiling. But her smile faltered the moment she saw his face. David held up the receipt between two fingers, his voice like crushed gravel. "Rebecca," he said, his tone deathly calm. "Care to explain this?" The color drained from her face so quickly it was as if someone had flipped a switch. For a fraction of a second, her eyes darted, not at him, but past him, toward the purse still spilled open on the floor, and that was all the confirmation David needed. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating. David could hear nothing but the distant ticking of the kitchen clock and the slow, controlled rhythm of his own breathing. His fingers clenched around the hotel receipt, the crumpled paper pressing into his palm. Rebecca didn't speak right away. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly as if words were forming but refusing to take shape. Then, in an instant, she composed herself, a quick, practiced recovery. What is that?" she asked, feigning confusion. David exhaled slowly, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. "Don't do that, Rebecca." His eyes bore into hers. "You know exactly what this is." She hesitated, a flicker of something. Guilt? Fear? Flashing across her face before she smothered it. "David, I don't know what you're talking about. Where did you even—" "Your purse?" His voice was a notch colder now. "I was looking for my keys." A beat of silence. Her jaw tensed. She glanced at the receipt again, this time truly seeing it. "That's not what you think," she said finally, her tone measured, controlled. David let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Then by all means, explain it to me." Rebecca swallowed, shifting her weight slightly. She was thinking, calculating. He could see it, the wheels turning in her mind, crafting a story, testing possible lies. "Hey, she stopped, then tried again. "I was helping a friend." David's lips pressed into a thin line. "A friend?" he repeated. "At a hotel?" "Yes." She exhaled sharply. "She was going through a tough time. Needed somewhere to stay for the night. I booked the room for her." There it was. A quick, simple explanation. Too simple. Too neat. David didn't blink. "Who?" Rebecca flinched. "Who?" he asked again, slower this time. She hesitated a fraction too long. "You don't know her." "Try me." More hesitation. David nodded to himself. "That's what I thought." Rebecca's hands curled into fists, her expression shifting from uncertainty to irritation. "You're interrogating me over nothing, David. I don't understand why you're acting like this." David inhaled deeply through his nose, his patience fraying at the edges. "Because I know you," he said. "I know when you're lying, and right now, Rebecca, You're lying. Her lips parted as if she was about to argue, but then she stopped herself. She crossed her arms instead, adopting a defensive posture. Fine, she muttered, voice clipped. If you don't believe me, then don't. David let out another dry laugh. Oh, I believe something happened. I just don't believe your version of it. Rebecca's eyes darkened. So what, David? You think I'm cheating on you? The accusation hung between them, an open wound in the air. David held her gaze, his silence answer enough. A scoff left her lips. Unbelievable, she muttered, shaking her head. After all these years, this is what you think of me? But I think, David repeated, his grip tightening on the receipt. I think my wife was at a hotel the same night I was out of town, and I think she's standing here right now, lying to my face about it. Rebecca ran a hand through her hair, her frustration mounting. You have no proof. David's brow arched. No proof? He took a deliberate step closer, his voice now quiet but sharp. You mean aside from the receipt in my hand? Or do you mean aside from the money you've been withdrawing lately? Expensive restaurants, hotel transactions. Should I keep going? Rebecca's breath caught. David watched the way her expression flickered. The subtle shift of panic she tried to mask, but it was there. He saw it, and it hit him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't innocent. The weight of the realization settled over him, cold and heavy. He had spent so many years believing in their marriage, trusting her. Now all that trust was crumbling, reduced to nothing more than a pile of worthless memories. Rebecca must have sensed his shift because her tone changed. Softer now, almost pleading. David, I love you. A bitter taste coated his tongue. Love, he echoed, voice hollow. Is that what this is? She reached for his hand, but he pulled back. His voice was low, controlled, but beneath the surface, he was seething. Rebecca let her hand drop. She looked away for a moment, then back at him, something resembling regret flickering in her eyes. Can we talk about this? David studied her. Maybe months ago, before the receipt, before the suspicion, he would have wanted to sit down, work through this, try to salvage what they had, but not now. Not anymore. He stepped back, his decision forming like steel inside him. I already have my answer, he said quietly. And for the first time in their marriage, Rebecca had nothing left to say. David sat alone in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He could still hear Rebecca's voice echoing in his head, her feeble attempts at denial, the defensive tone that had crumbled into something dangerously close to regret. But regret wasn't enough. Regret didn't erase betrayal. He had driven aimlessly for the past hour, the city lights blurring into streaks of color as his thoughts swirled in an endless loop. Part of him wanted to go home, to sit Rebecca down and demand the truth, the entire truth, stripped of all her careful half-lies. But the other part, the part that had hardened the moment he saw her reaction to the receipt, knew the truth already, and it burnt. Finally, his mind settled. He wasn't going to waste another minute drowning in uncertainty. He needed proof, solid, undeniable proof. With that thought, he pulled into the dimly lit parking lot of the Westmore Inn, the very place where his world had cracked open. The night clerk barely looked up as David walked in. The lobby smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning chemicals, the kind of scent that tried to mask something less pleasant. David leaned against the counter, forcing himself to appear calm. I need some information. The young man behind the desk, barely out of his 20s, gave him a tired look. Sir, we can't release guest information. David reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and slid it across the counter. The clerk hesitated but eventually took it, glancing around before lowering his voice. What do you need? David placed the receipt on the counter. This room. Who checked in with my wife? The clerk glanced at it, then at David, something unreadable flickering across his face. He hesitated before typing into his computer. The seconds stretched unbearably long before he finally looked up. She wasn't alone, he said carefully. David's stomach clenched. He swallowed hard. Who was with her? The clerk hesitated again. A man, middle age. Name on the registry was Tom Hayes. Tom Hayes. David repeated the name in his mind, letting it settle like a stone in his gut. Now, he knew a Tom. No, it couldn't be. The memory came fast and sharp. Rebecca's company holiday party last year. She had introduced David to one of her colleagues, a tall, cocky man with an easy grin. Tom. He had shaken David's hand firmly, laughed at his jokes, and talked about business as if he cared. David had to like him. A sick feeling coiled in his stomach. Had it been happening since then? Had Rebecca and Tom shared glances across the office, stolen moments behind closed doors? Had David been nothing more than a placeholder while they played their twisted little game? He exhaled, forcing himself to stay composed. Do you have security footage? The clerk's expression hardened. That's where I draw the line, sir. David had pushed his luck enough. He nodded, stepping away. But as he turned to leave, the clerk spoke again, his voice quieter. Look, man, I've seen a lot of things working here. The way she checked in, it wasn't her first time. David froze. She knew what she was doing, the clerk added, almost apologetically. She knew the process, knew the layout, even requested a specific room. It wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was deliberate. David walked out of the hotel, his breath coming in short bursts. His fingers twitched at his sides, itching to break something, to smash his fist into a wall and release the fury clawing inside him. But instead, he got into his car, gripping the steering wheel once more, forcing himself to breathe. One thing was clear now. He wasn't just a fool. He was a blind fool. Rebecca had been playing him for a long time, carefully curating a version of herself that suited him while hiding another life beneath the surface. A life with Tom. A life he hadn't been meant to uncover. But he had, and now she was going to face the consequences. David didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove to a small, nondescript cafe that stayed open late, ordering a coffee he barely touched. He spent the next few hours going through Rebecca's phone records, their joint bank account, anything that might paint a clearer picture. It was worse than he imagined. Recurring hotel charges, expensive dinners, withdrawals from ATMs near places he had never been, and worst of all, messages. He found them in their shared cloud backup, hidden beneath folders she must have thought he'd never check. Rebecca, last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. Tom, you were perfect, baby. He's still clueless, right? David gritted his teeth. His fingers hovered over his phone, the urge to call her almost unbearable. But no, not yet. Not like this. He wasn't going to yell. He wasn't going to beg. He was going to make sure Rebecca and Tom felt every ounce of betrayal they had inflicted on him. When he finally stood up to leave the cafe, the first slivers of morning light were breaking across the horizon. He had spent the entire night gathering proof, ensuring there was no room for doubt. Now it was time for the next move. Rebecca had built this deception carefully, brick by brick. David was about to tear it down. David did go home, not yet. Instead, he drove in silence, gripping the wheel with the same intensity he had when he first found the receipt. The city around him was waking up. Early risers jogging along sidewalks, the smell of fresh bread drifting from a nearby bakery, commuters filling the roads. It was a normal morning for everyone else. But for David, nothing felt normal anymore. He had spent the night piecing together the truth, combing through messages and transactions, unraveling Rebecca's careful web of deception. And now, as he pulled into a quiet parking lot near their home, a single thought burned in his mind. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. For years, David had been the steady one, the provider, the man who put his family first. He had given Rebecca a life of comfort, of stability, and in return, she had repaid him with betrayal. The weight of it sat heavy in his chest. He had two choices. One, confront her privately, let the anger consume him, let her tears and excuses spill out while she begged for forgiveness. Or two, make sure she felt the same humiliation, the same gut-wrenching agony he'd felt when he found that receipt. David tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, his jaw tightening. He knew which choice he was making. With one last breath, he grabbed his phone and dialed a number he never thought he'd call. Hey man, the voice on the other end answered groggily. Mark, I need a favor. There was a pause. David, you okay? David almost laughed. No, he wasn't okay, but that didn't matter right now. I need you to come to dinner tonight, he said. At our place. Mark hesitated. Something wrong? David clenched his jaw. Just be there. And bring your wife. Mark was one of their closest friends, part of the tight-knit circle that Rebecca had fooled so effortlessly. Tonight, he was going to see the real Rebecca. By the time David finally walked into his house, Rebecca was already awake, sipping coffee at the kitchen counter. She glanced up, eyes wary. You didn't come home last night. David set his keys down, his expression unreadable. I had things to do. Rebecca watched him closely, sensing the shift in his demeanor. David, we need to talk about last night. Oh, we will, he said smoothly, pouring himself a cup of coffee. In fact, we'll talk about a lot of things. He took a sip. Tonight. Over dinner, her fingers tightened around her mug. dinner? I invited Mark and Lisa. He met her gaze, letting the silence stretch between them. Thought it would be nice to have company. Rebecca blinked. He could see the flicker of panic in her eyes, the rapid calculations running through her head. She had no idea what was coming. That evening, David set the stage carefully. The dining table was immaculate, candles flickering softly, the scent of rosemary and garlic filling the air. To anyone else, it looked like a perfect dinner setting. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Mark and Lisa arrived first, cheerful as always. Lisa complimented Rebecca's dress, and Mark gave David a friendly pat on the back. Feels like forever since we had one of these, Mark said, settling into his chair. Rebecca smiled, tight, forced. Yes, it does. David took his seat, watching his wife from across the table. She was tense, her fingers gripping the stem of her wine glass. Good. They exchanged small talk at first, the usual pleasantries, but David was only half listening. His moment was coming. And then, as he swirled the wine in his glass, he struck. Rebecca, he said casually, tell everyone about your friend Tom. Rebecca's hand froze midair. The color drained from her face. Mark and Lisa looked at each other, confused. Tom? Lisa asked. Who's Tom? David leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. Oh, just someone Rebecca's been spending a lot of time with. The room went still. Rebecca set her glass down carefully. David, she said, her voice low, warning. But he wasn't stopping. He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapping a few times before placing it on the table, screen up. Messages, the bank statements, the hotel charges, all of it. Lisa gasped. Mark's expression darkened. Rebecca's face crumbled. Guess this is a joke, she whispered, shaking her head. David, you don't... David cut her off, his voice cold. Don't insult me by lying again. She stared at him, breathing shallow, her entire body trembling. Lisa was the first to speak. Rebecca, tell me this isn't real. But she didn't. She couldn't. The truth lay bare on the table between them. David pushed back his chair, standing slowly. You thought I'd never find out, he said, looking down at her. You thought I'd stay blind. Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it again, her eyes glistening with tears. You didn't just betray me, David continued. You betrayed us, every person in this room who thought they knew you. Lisa looked disgusted. Mark just shook his head, unable to meet Rebecca's eyes. David exhaled, feeling lighter than he had in days. He had done what he came to do. With that, he picked up his phone and walked toward the door. Rebecca's voice cracked behind him. David? Please! He paused, turning slightly, but he didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. David stepped out into the cool night air, the distant hum of the city, a stark contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. The weight on his chest, the suffocating pressure of betrayal felt lighter now. Not gone, but bearable. He had done what he needed to do. As he walked to his car, he could still hear voices from inside. Lisa's shocked whispers, Mark's low, furious tone, and Rebecca, her voice breaking, pleading. But David didn't turn back. He got into the car, shut the door, and exhaled. For the first time in days, his mind wasn't clouded by doubt. He wasn't trapped in an endless cycle of questioning and second-guessing. He knew exactly where he stood now. And more importantly, he knew where he was going. Oh, not their home. Not anymore. He drove in silence, gripping the wheel, his knuckles no longer white with rage, but steady with resolve. He had spent the last decade building a life with Rebecca, believing in her, trusting her, and she had dismantled it all, piece by piece, behind his back. But he wasn't the man she thought he was. He wasn't weak, he wasn't naive, and he sure as hell wasn't going to be her fool. When he pulled up to the house, it no longer felt like home. It felt like a crime scene, the place where everything had unraveled. The soft glow of the porch light illuminated the neatly trimmed hedges, the welcome mat that suddenly seemed ironic. He stepped inside, and the silence greeted him. He moved with purpose. Straight to the bedroom, a suitcase, a duffel bag. He packed only what mattered: clothes, personal documents, a few photographs. The rest, he didn't need it. The house, the furniture, the carefully chosen decorations that Rebecca had obsessed over. It was all just things. None of it meant anything anymore. He found his wedding band on the nightstand where he had left it before his shower the previous night. He stared at it for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket, not out of sentimentality, but as a reminder, a lesson burned into metal. He wouldn't forget. As he zipped the last bag, he heard a car pull into the driveway. Rebecca, he didn't hurry, he was already done here. The front door opened, and she rushed in, breathless, eyes wide. David, please. He didn't stop moving. I mean, just listen to me. He lifted the suitcase and walked past her, heading for the door. She grabbed his arm. You can't just leave like this. David finally turned to face her. And what he saw wasn't the confident, put-together woman he had once loved. She looked small now, desperate, stripped of all the arrogance she had carried in her deception. Rebecca, he said, his voice calm, almost eerily so. You made that decision for me. Her grip tightened. We can fix this. We can go to therapy. You don't have to do this. David's lips curved, but there was no humor in his smile. Therapy? He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Tell me, Rebecca, was that your plan before or after you checked into that hotel? Before or after you whispered to Tom that I was clueless? She flinched. I've made a mistake. David tilted his head slightly, studying her. A mistake is leaving the stove on. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. What you did, that was a choice. Over and over again. Tears filled her eyes, but David felt nothing. No sympathy, no anger, just exhaustion. You don't have to leave like this, she whispered. David exhaled slowly. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wedding band, and placed it in her palm. I already did. He walked out. Rebecca didn't follow him this time. 1 year later, David sat at a quiet cafe, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly as he scrolled through his phone. His lawyer had finalized everything months ago. Clean separation, no lingering ties. Rebecca had tried reaching out a few times, sending long, rambling messages, but he never responded. He had nothing left to say. Instead, he had focused on himself, his career, his health, his peace, and for the first time in years, he felt free. David, he looked up. A woman stood before him, smiling warmly. She was familiar, not from his past, but from the new life he had been building. Someone who had slowly become part of his routine. Didn't expect to see you here, she said, tilting her head playfully. David smiled, a real one this time. Maybe it's fate, she laughed. Maybe it is. He gestured to the empty seat. Care to join me? She sat down, and as they started talking, David realized something. The past no longer haunted him. Rebecca's betrayal had once consumed him, threatened to break him, but in the end, it had set him free. And now he was ready to live again.